Ever had one of those moments where you completely flip-flopped on something you once held dear? Maybe you swore you'd never touch sushi, and now you're the first in line at the local Japanese joint. Or perhaps you were dead set against getting a pet, but now you're that person who shows everyone pictures of their fur baby. Well, guess what? Even the Catholic Church isn't immune to these grand reversals. And boy, did they have a doozy when it came to capital punishment. Picture this. It's way back when, and the idea of an eye for an eye is all the rage. The church was totally on board with this Old Testament classic. They were like that strict teacher who always sided with the principle. If you messed up big time, you could kiss your life goodbye. For centuries, this was just how things rolled. The church and the government were thick as thieves, giving each other high fives over their shared power to punish wrongdoers. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hold up a sec. Isn't the church supposed to be all about forgiveness and turning the other cheek? Well, yes and no. See, back then, they had this idea that by punishing criminals harshly, they were actually doing God's work. It's like they thought they were the divine bouncers of society, keeping the riffraff in line. Even some of the big-name church thinkers were on board with this. Take St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. This guy was basically the Einstein of Catholic philosophy, and he gave capital punishment 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. He thought it was totally fine and dandy to execute dangerous criminals, calling it praiseworthy and beneficial. Talk about harsh grading. But here's where things get interesting. As time marched on, people started to question whether the whole off-with-their-heads approach was really the best way to handle things. It's like society collectively woke up one day with a massive hangover and thought, whoa, maybe there's a better way to deal with criminals than, killing them. This shift didn't happen overnight, though. It was more like a slow-motion light bulb moment that took a couple of centuries to fully click. As the 18th century rolled around, more and more voices started piping up saying, hey, maybe we should rethink this whole capital punishment thing. It's kind of like when you start to question whether your favorite childhood snack is actually good for you. At first, you brush it off, but then you start to notice more and more people talking about it. And eventually, you can't ignore it anymore. So, what changed? Well, a bunch of things. For starters, society as a whole was making progress. People were starting to think more about human rights and dignity. It's like we collectively leveled up as a species and realized, oh wait, maybe killing people isn't the most civilized way to handle things. Also, the focus started to shift from punishment to rehabilitation. It's like society went from being that strict parent who's all about consequences to the cool teacher who believes in second chances. This new way of thinking spread like wildfire. One by one, countries started crossing capital punishment off their to-do lists. It was like a domino effect of compassion sweeping across the globe. And you might be wondering, where was the church during all this? Well, they were definitely paying attention. But change doesn't come easy when you've been doing things a certain way for, a couple thousand years. But even the church couldn't ignore the changing tides forever. In 1969, the Vatican City, that tiny country within Rome where the Pope lives, decided to drop capital punishment altogether. It's like they were dipping their toes in the water of change, testing to see how it felt. Not bad, they probably thought. Maybe this whole not executing people thing isn't so crazy after all. Then came the 1990s, and things really started to heat up. The church released a new edition of its catechism, think of it as the official rulebook for Catholics, in 1992. In it, they said, okay, maybe capital punishment is still okay, but only in super-duper extreme cases. It's like they were leaving the door open just a crack, Like when your mom says, we'll see, and there's still a chance. Enter Pope John Paul II. This guy was a real mover and shaker in the church, and he had some thoughts about capital punishment. In 1995, he wrote a document called Evangelium Vitae, fancy Latin for the Gospel of Life. In it, he basically said, look, I get that sometimes it might seem necessary to execute someone to protect society, but guys, we've got prisons now. We can keep dangerous folks locked up without killing them. It's like the church finally realized they could have their cake and eat it too. They could protect society from dangerous criminals and give those same criminals a chance at redemption. Talk about a win-win. Fast forward to 2018, and Pope Francis decides it's time to go all in. He looks at the catechism and says, you know what? Let's just say capital punishment is never okay. And just like that, with a few strokes of a pen, centuries of church teaching got a major update. The new stance? Capital punishment is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and is inadmissible in all cases. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's like the church went from being the strict parent to the cool, progressive grandparent who's more open-minded than you are. Now, you might think that everyone in the church would be thrilled about this change. After all, isn't preserving life a pretty core Christian value? Well, turns out it's not that simple. Some folks in the church were totally on board, cheering from the sidelines like it was the Super Bowl of moral progress. They saw it as a natural extension of the church's teachings on the sanctity of life and human dignity. It's like they were saying, finally, this is what we've been talking about all along. But others, not so much. Some conservative Catholics felt like the rug had been pulled out from under them. They were like, hold up, we've been teaching this one way for centuries and now you want to change it? What gives? It's kind of like when your favorite band suddenly changes their style and you're left wondering if you even know them anymore. These critics argue that the new stance contradicts centuries of church teaching and even some parts of Scripture. It's like they're saying, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They worry that this change might open the door to other big shifts in church doctrine. So, the church has made this big declaration. But what does it actually mean in practice? Well, it's led to some pretty significant actions. For one, Catholic leaders have become vocal advocates against the death penalty. They're out there pleading for clemency in individual cases, like a lawyer making a last-ditch effort to save their client. And they're not just focusing on individual cases either. They're throwing their weight behind efforts to abolish capital punishment altogether. In countries where it's still a thing, it's kind of like when your friend becomes a vegan and suddenly starts sharing all those animal rights posts on social media. The church has taken on this cause with gusto, and they want everyone to know about it. But here's the thing. Just because the church says something doesn't mean all Catholics are automatically on board. It's like when your parents tell you to eat your vegetables, but you still sneak them to the dog under the table. In some places, the church's stance has had a big impact. Catholic majority countries that still had the death penalty started to reconsider their position. It's like when your cool friend gets into a new band, and suddenly you're curious to check them out too. But in other places like the United States, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. See, even though the church has said, no way, Jose, to capital punishment, not all Catholics are on board. There are still plenty of Catholic individuals who support the death penalty. This disconnect between official church teaching and what some Catholics actually believe has led to some interesting discussions. It's forced people to really think about what they believe and why. It's like when you have that late-night dorm room debate that makes you question everything you thought you knew. If the church can change its mind on this, what else might change? Some wonder. And if I disagree with the church on this, what does that mean for my faith? These are big, meaty questions without easy answers. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? Faith isn't supposed to be a set of rules you follow blindly. It's a living, breathing thing that grows and changes as we do. And sometimes that means grappling with tough issues and maybe even changing our minds. So why does all this matter? Well, it's not just about one specific issue. This whole saga shows us something pretty cool about how even the most traditional institutions can change and grow. Think about it. The Catholic Church has been around for about 2,000 years. That's older than sliced bread, older than the printing press. Heck, it's even older than your great-great-great, add a few more greats, grandparents. And yet, here it is, still capable of looking at an issue with fresh eyes and saying, you know what? Maybe we got this one wrong. It's kind of inspiring, isn't it? It's like watching your grandpa figure out how to use a smartphone. It reminds us that no matter how set in our ways we might be, there's always room for growth and change. And let's face it, in a world that sometimes feels like it's changing faster than we can keep up, that's a pretty comforting thought. But it also raises some interesting questions. If an institution as old and established as the Catholic Church can change its stance on something this big, what else might change in the future? And how do we balance tradition with progress? It's like trying to renovate a historic building. You want to keep the character and charm, but also make sure it's functional for modern life. And here's another thing to chew on. How do we, as individuals, handle it when an institution we're part of changes in a way we might not agree with? Do we go along with it? Push back? Leave altogether? There's no one-size-fits-all answer, but it's definitely food for thought. The Church's journey on this issue also shows us something about the power of evolving understanding. As we learn more about the world and ourselves, sometimes we have to be willing to admit that our old ways of thinking might not cut it anymore. It's like when you learn that Pluto isn't actually a planet. It can be a bit of a shock, but ultimately, it's about having a more accurate understanding of the universe. In the case of capital punishment, advances in our understanding of psychology, criminology, and human rights all played a role in shifting perspectives. We've learned more about the factors that lead people to commit crimes, the potential for rehabilitation, and the inherent dignity of every human life. It's like we've zoomed out and gotten a bigger picture of the whole situation. But let's not kid ourselves. This shift didn't happen in a vacuum. The Church's changing stance on capital punishment is part of a broader conversation happening in society. It's tied up with discussions about justice, mercy, human rights, and the role of punishment in our legal systems. It's like one thread in a big, complex tapestry of social change. And here's something else to consider. The Church's new stance on this issue has put it in an interesting position. On one hand, it's aligned itself more closely with human rights organizations and progressive social movements. On the other hand, it's created some tension with more conservative elements, both within and outside the Church. It's like that moment when you realize your parents are actually pretty cool, but now your more traditional relatives are giving you side-eye at family gatherings. This whole situation also raises some interesting questions about the relationship between religious teachings and civil law. In countries where Catholicism is the dominant religion, how does this new Church stance influence legal policy? And in more secular countries, how do Catholic politicians balance their religious beliefs with their civic duties? It's like trying to bake a cake with ingredients that don't always want to mix together. At the end of the day, the Church's journey on this issue is a reminder that even the most seemingly unchangeable things can evolve. It's a testament to the power of rethinking our assumptions and being open to new ideas. And who knows, maybe it'll inspire us to take a second look at some of our own long-held beliefs. So, there you have it, folks. The Catholic Church's journey from eye for an eye to every life is precious has been a long and winding road. It's a story of tradition meeting progress, of ancient teachings grappling with modern realities. It's also a reminder that our views on big, important issues can change over time. And that's okay. In fact, it might even be a good thing. It shows we're growing, learning, and trying to do better. So next time you find yourself changing your mind about something you once believed in, remember, even an institution as old and established as the Catholic Church can have a change of heart. Who knows? Maybe your flip-flop on pineapple pizza isn't so crazy after all. After all, if the Church can go from supporting capital punishment to opposing it, anything's possible. Just don't expect them to change their stance on fish on Fridays during Lent anytime soon. Some traditions are here to stay.